All right, well, good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to welcome you all to our roundtable event today on strengthening tribal and agency partnerships. I'm Jeremy Sorgen, postdoctoral researcher here at UC Berkeley with the Cannabis Research Center. The CRC does interdisciplinary research on the social and environmental dimensions of cannabis and uses this research to drive good public policy. I want to thank the Social Science Matrix for hosting this event, as well as the Department of Cannabis Control for its interest and support of this timely topic. This panel comes out of a 2-year DCC-funded project that brought together UC Berkeley and a statewide committee of tribal historic preservation officers and other tribal representatives. The project investigated tribal sovereignty in the cannabis permitting process and the impact of cannabis cultivation on tribal cultural resources. We conducted 2 surveys, one with agency representatives and one with tribal representatives, and we did over 60 interviews. In total, we spoke to around 85 individuals working at the intersection of cannabis permitting and tribal consultation. In addition to forthcoming journal articles and policy reports, we are now in the process of developing educational and training materials, of which this is one example, this recorded roundtable today. The idea to do a roundtable on tribal agency partnerships came from conversations I had with agency and tribal representatives in Humboldt County. Early on in the research, I learned that Humboldt had met with tribal leaders long before the passage of AB 52 to co-develop a consultation policy that would help to protect tribal cultural resources. This relationship has developed since then, and the goal is for the speakers today to share their experiences, both good and bad, for the benefit of tribes and agencies across the state who are just beginning to establish working relationships with each other. So to get us started, and I want to be brief so that we have as much time as possible for our speakers, I wanted to just mention a few key concepts. So California Proposition 64 legalized the adult use and sale of cannabis within the state of California. This was in 2016. California Assembly Bill 52 came in around the same time, and that requires CEQA lead agencies to notify tribes about all projects that are subject to CEQA review. So this would include cannabis as well as other development projects throughout the state. AB 52 also introduces the language of tribal cultural resources into California state law. So what are tribal cultural resources? AB 52 defines tribal cultural resources as sites, features, places, cultural landscapes, and sacred places or objects that have cultural value or significance to a tribe. So TCRs are not only archaeological resources, importantly, they can also be landscape features and other elements of tribal cultural and religious practices, including waterways, viewsheds, stories, and other things that a tribe values. Tribal representatives are considered experts, appropriate for providing substantial evidence regarding the locations, types, and significance of tribal cultural resources within their traditionally and culturally affiliated geographic areas. Finally, tribal consultation. Tribal consultation is a meaningful and timely process that takes into consideration tribal values and the views of tribal representatives. Meetings should include decision makers and are ideally face-to-face. Consultation should protect confidentiality regarding places that hold traditional tribal significance. As written in AB 52, consultation with tribes is considered the most effective way for lead agencies to determine if a project could result in significant environmental impacts to tribal cultural resources. So before I introduce our speakers, I want to mention that you can use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your Zoom browser to comment and ask questions, and we will have some time for questions toward the end of our roundtable. And now I'd like to introduce today's speakers. So first is Leif Hillman. Leif is a member of the Karuk tribe and former director of the Karuk Department of Natural Resources. He has dedicated his career to protecting, preserving, and restoring Klamath River fisheries and Karuk cultural resources. He has served in various positions of leadership with the Karuk tribe, intertribal commissions, and state boards. Next, we'll have Steve Madrone, who is 5th District Supervisor for Humboldt County and currently chair of the board. This is his second term as supervisor, and he has a long history of engagement with Humboldt's rural communities, having been involved in watershed restoration and training programs over the past 50 years. Earl Crosby is the former deputy director of the watershed branch for the Karuk Department of Natural Resources. Near the end of his 20-year career, he administrated the cannabis program, which tackled issues revolving around legal and illegal cannabis grows operating within the Karuk Aboriginal territory. And finally, Caitlin Castellano was the cannabis planner at the County of Humboldt's Planning and Building Department between 2017 and 2020. She coordinated project referrals to the tribe and communicated the tribe's requests to the applicants. She also prepared staff reports and made recommendations to the governing body on cannabis applications. Thank you very much. I'm so delighted to have our speakers with us today. And with that, I'll hand it over to Leif to get us started.
So good afternoon, everyone. I wanted to begin this discussion today by talking about tribal consultation in a broad, general manner, drawing on 30+ years of personal experience. So ignore the reference to tribal county consultation on the title of my talk, and instead think county, state, and federal consultation. Over the course of 30+ years, I've been involved and participated in countless failed consultation efforts that produced lots of ill will, frustration, anger, and on occasion, bitter litigation that no one was happy about in the end. So I've also had the opportunity to participate in many successful consultation efforts that in some cases have resulted in the development of new and innovative and effective models of collaboration and co-management that made positive, lasting changes. So, of course, the latter never quite received the level of attention that is generated by the former, as you might imagine. So you might ask, what makes the difference between success and failure? The answer is always the same. It's people. And it doesn't really matter if you work for a federal, state, or county, or a tribal agency. Chances are you're a human being and a person. So a person who has a life and a job, friends and family, and you want to do your job and you do it well, but there's only so many hours in a day. And certainly it's not your job to reach out to someone who doesn't respond to a letter, which is I've heard countless times in the past. And besides, maybe you're not even sure if the people that you're reaching out to even care about the subject matter that you're trying to consult with them on. I've had people tell me, yeah, I've been to the casino. I go to the casino occasionally, but I've never even seen any Indians there. So, I think for folks who aren't part of the tribal community and don't have, close contacts there, there's a lot of misconceptions about tribal people and about, what's the best way to consult with tribes. And I'll say, I don't think it's any secret here. It's in order to be successful, people have to see and treat one another as human beings with empathy and respect. And that's all there is to the secret sauce. If you deal with people with empathy and respect, I think that's the deal that you need. So now bear with me for a minute as I venture a little bit into the weeds here. And I'll just say it's very important that we all recognize and acknowledge that county, state, federal, and tribal jurisdictional authority and regulatory processes can and do overlap with much greater frequency than most people are aware of. This often results in complex and confusing regulatory schemes that are ripe for conflict. One relevant example I'll talk about here specifically applies to cannabis permitting. And so back in 2021, I think at the same time that the county of Humboldt was engaged in a public process to update their cannabis ordinance, and had initiated consultation with the area tribes, the California Fish and Wildlife Agency, along with the California State Water Board, had each independently initiated consultation with the tribes as well concerning their proposed cannabis permitting processes. This is a good example for us to examine as it highlights some common challenges faced by tribes when consulting with multiple agencies. Let's start with the fact that there are at least, I think at present, something like 8 or 9 federally recognized Indian tribes in Humboldt County, and over 35 tribes in the North Coast region of California alone. Each of these tribes are unique and very widely in terms of their population, land base, governing structures, jurisdictional authority, and capacity. In this particular instance, all 3 of these agencies had sent out letters to all of the area tribes inviting them to consult on their specific proposed processes. The Karuk tribe responded to and engaged in consultation with all 3, while other tribes prioritized their engagement based on their own capacity, while others still, for whatever reasons, chose not to engage at all. The 3 consultation processes were moving forward at different and various speeds, but all of them were under some kind of a time crunch. And managing just these 3 processes required some advanced planning and prioritization on our part. As our internal team began our initial review of these 3 different processes, it became apparent that these 3 agencies, 1 county and 2 states, 2 state agencies had not coordinated with one another. And as a result, these distinct processes contained inconsistent timelines and contradictory provisions. Then, just for good measure and to muddy things up a little bit more, a completely new state agency created by the ballot measure that legalized California recreational use of cannabis initiated their own consultation with the tribe concerning their proposed licensing process. My point here is simply that no one at that time could tell you how any of these separate, distinct processes would work together to provide a clear pathway out of the shadows and into the sunshine of regulatory compliance. And considering the fast-moving, confusing, and complex consultation environment that tribes found themselves in, no one should be surprised that these consultation efforts generally fell short of what one would call success. Before I go any deeper into the weeds and talk about what these 3 agency processes had in common, this seems like a good place just to mention a couple of cautionary tales here to agency staff who might be participating here today. And the caution I would give here is try to avoid making broad assumptions. Please don't assume that you know and understand what a tribe's interests are in whatever your topic or subject matter that you wish to consult about. For example, do not mail your consultation request to a tribe along with an excerpt or a specific chapter of your proposed ordinance or draft permitting process that pertains only the protection of archaeological or cultural resources, because you assume that's the only part a tribe will be interested in. Likewise, do not assume that your definition of cultural or archaeological resources is the same as a tribe would define them. Now, to summarize the outcome of this complex, confusing time, the Karuk tribe prioritized our consultation efforts first with the county of Humboldt and with their proposed revised ordinance. We ended up focusing in and submitting substantial comments and even suggested language related to the definition of significant cultural resources. And ultimately, we're successful in shaping that definition within their ordinance to meet our needs. Our argument was simple: who's best qualified to determine if a site is significant or not? And I'll give you all three guesses what the correct answer is here, but I won't count the first two. Now, then we reached out to the State Water Resources Control Board and offered to host an in-person tribal consultation meeting in Orleans. Prior to this meeting, we advised the water board that we were concerned over a specific provision that existed within the draft permitting process designed to protect cultural sites and properties that would unilaterally prohibit the issuance of any permit by either the state of California or the county of Humboldt within a 12,000 acre area of northern Humboldt County. This early communication allowed water board staff sufficient time to engage with legal counsel and come to the meeting prepared to deal with this important issue. And if it sounds like I'm blowing my own horn or bragging here, let me just say to the state of California and Humboldt County, you're very welcome. When the dust finally settled, the Karuk tribe was able to develop and implement our own review process to evaluate whether or not an applicant under the county's permitting process would have an adverse effect or impact on significant tribal resources, and if there was a way to mitigate those effects. Our program was designed to be self-supporting and add no extra time to the overall process for the permittee. In a word, it was a successful process. And I'll stop there and catch my breath. And I think that's the general gist of what I wanted to cover in my opening remarks.
Thank you, Leif. And now we're going to hear from Steve Madrone.
Leif, very much appreciate that introduction. You covered a lot of good ground there and a lot of things to consider. You know, as far as the county is concerned, you know, we got into the cannabis legalization process because of the laws that changed at the state level. And we've been working to develop good relationships with the tribes in Humboldt County. But we were already, even before that ordinance, where we're referring projects to tribes as part of a normal agency review process. But that doesn't mean that we provided the tribes with the resources to be able to respond. And I think that's something I'm going to come back to here in a minute. You know, the 600-foot setback established by the California Medical Marijuana Land Use Ordinance, which was our first ordinance, created that 600-foot setback that gave tribes the ability to reduce and you know, distance from impacts. And it came from the environmental document, which was a negative deck. For various reasons, our first ordinance was done with a negative deck, and then we came around with our second ordinance and did an environmental impact report, which further strengthened some of our approaches, et cetera. But the negative deck, you know, you couldn't really have potential impact to archaeological or cultural resources as part of that. And I appreciate that, as Leif said, you know, agencies' view of what that might be very different than what the tribes perceive to be important resources. So it's important, I think, what he said there in regards to not just trying to categorize things and put them in a box, but to really approach this with an open mind, human to human, trying to understand what the impacts are and what's important. Anyway, the only way to ensure that, you know, this protection occurred was to give the tribes a voice in what happened around those resources. And so the county made sure that that was part of our process. But with this new negative deck in the ordinance, it didn't really change what we were already basically doing, at least from the county's perspective. Not that it was working necessarily well, but we did have a process in place. One of the questions was, what have been some of the practical results of the government to government work that we do in regards to cannabis? And I would say that one of the results is that some significant tribal resources have been protected. Has it been perfect? No, not by any means. We have a long way to go. But it is interesting that the county, was given this direction, and we basically have provided the tribes at least to give us direction, if not jurisdiction, over cannabis impacts to tribal resources, cultural sites. And there's no provision for the county to overrule a declaration by a tribal council that something is a tribal cultural resources. And there have been a number of projects that have been denied or not processed due to being in or near a tribal cultural resource. There's been an instance on the Klamath River where that occurred, but even more recently with the Wiyot tribe over at the Sierra Pacific Mill on Samoa Boulevard, where there was a proposal for a very large cannabis operation. And the Wiyot tribe said, no, this is a sacred site. In fact, it was a burial ground for a lot of folks from the Indian Island massacre and all that. And the site's highly disturbed, but the Wiyot tribe made it very clear that no, this is not okay with us. So that project was denied. But I will say that, this process that we have whereby we send out referrals to the tribes when we have applications for cannabis in areas of ancestral areas, we often know that we're overwhelming the tribal historic preservation officers, the TIPOs. I just had a conversation not longer than an hour or two ago in Hoopa about how, they get notices in part of their square up in Supply Creek, but it can be 100 a month, in terms of referral requests, and they have one staff person. So it can be totally overwhelming. And then the county will sit back and go, well, we didn't get any response. It's like, well, of course you didn't. We've overwhelmed the tribe to even be able to do that. So I know that that's one area that we absolutely need to think about how that's working and how we can improve that system, how we can provide resources to tribes to even be able to respond to all these referral requests. Because, most referrals go out to other government agencies who have a budget and funding for staff and personnel like Department of Fish and Wildlife or whatever to respond. But that's not necessarily true in tribes, having those resources to be able to do that. So just the fact that there's no response doesn't mean it's okay. And so I would say that's one of the areas that I think things are not working well, and we need to think about how to make that better. So that would be my introductory comments. Thank you.
Well, thank you. And next, we're going to hear from Earl.
Good afternoon. First off, let me start out by thanking both Jeremy and Laura for convening this webinar on a very important issue regarding cannabis cultivation and consultation with tribes. I'd also like to thank my fellow panelists for taking the time out of their busy days to add depth and understanding regarding this issue. And on that note, a lot of what, Leaf and Steve have already spoken to you about. I'm going to cover just a few of the same points because some of those same points are very, very important when looking at just not cannabis cultivation and permitting, but just consultation with tribes in general. Before I'm kind of repeating what Leaf said, we engaged the county early in ordinance development in order to, have language which respects tribal sovereignty and allows protection of tribal cultural resources, through that process. Because a lot of the folks who are cultivating cannabis in our area are, pretty much, some of them are in the lowlands, which are very, very important to the tribe. Old village sites, old ceremonial sites. So there's a lot of impacts that we couldn't address before the Humboldt County's cannabis ordinance that they put through. I think the key factor, I believe, for the success of the Humboldt County's ordinance, at least for the Karuk, is the ability to define a TCR by ourselves, not have somebody define it for us, and exercise that inherent self-determination in protecting those resources that we deem significant. While I was administrating the cannabis program for the Karuk Tribe's Department of Natural Resources, I view the potential impacts, of cannabis cultivation on tribal resources no different than any other proposed project, by the county, by the feds, by the state. I mean, it's looked at it all the same. There is no, favoritism toward the cannabis cultivators, just like I would in favor of the Forest Service, depending on what they were doing. So our main goal was to avoid the impacts to these tribal cultural resources. At times, we could devise mitigation measures. In other cases, mitigation measures were not feasible on these sites, and we recommended outright denial of the application, and those were honored, which was, that was something I found to be very, very heartening. See, in each of these applications, they're reviewed on a case-by-case basis. We also exercise our tribal sovereignty by having our own internal process where the potential applicant voluntarily entered into an agreement. So it helped us a little bit with our cost recovery. And it's also allowed us to engage them directly, not just looking at a piece of paper and looking at a map and kind of just, drawing circles and X's and squares. We actually able to get on the ground, talk to these folks, and see what their operation or proposed operation was going to look like and what their, illegal operation looked like before that. So we also were able to arrange the sites visits, which was great. We also be able to sit down and talk and agree to mitigation measures were appropriate and future monitoring, so we can go back and look to see to ensure that these mitigations measures that they had agreed to with the tribe are being followed. I believe that we were unique in this aspect and quite frankly innovative. I have not heard of any other tribe, taking this route and engaging those project proponents directly on the ground and coming up to an agreement between us and them to, process their applications. So that helped us tremendously. As Leif said earlier, tribal cultural resources are not always tangible. It's not something you can just reach out and touch. It could be just, as a place that's cultural significance, and it's hard to explain what that is. That's why you allow tribes to be able to make that determination, what they determine as significant. All too often, agencies try to impose their own definitions, which all that does is, I would say, it creates animosities, as Leif had talked about earlier, and friction. Usually, if there's no ARC site records, then some agencies, they don't consider it, important. Unless it's been surveyed and, something been rooting around in there like a groundhog. To achieve our goals of protecting these TCRs, and what Leif was saying earlier, the secret sauce, which he taught me over 20 years, is building that positive staff-to-staff relationship, just human to human, be able to sit down and have the discussions and, leave our respective egos at the door. Some agencies, personnel are really perceptive of what constitutes a tribal cultural resource. While others, they have difficulty with the very concept of TCRs and what constitutes such a resource. And at times, I think it was they didn't like to lose that little bit of power that they had, or they believed they have, or perceived they had over, other, agencies and other personnel and just your human citizens out there on the ground. So that could be a problem. But I have to say, with Caitlin, she'd be coming up next. She was my counterpart with the county at the time. She picked up on the concept of TCR, rather quickly, and was an all-around good human and an excellent person to work with. And that was another example of having the right people in the right place at the right time, being able to work together and work through these processes. See, on the other end of the spectrum, working on wildland fires, as a designated tribal representative, or in staff-to-staff discussions with the Forest Service on project planning, some folks just couldn't wrap their head around what a TCR is, and why it is important to avoid or mitigate impacts. This, as Leaf said earlier, this ultimately led to frustration, a breakdown of communication, and at times ultimately confrontation, depending on the impacts they were proposing on a resource that the tribe deemed to be significant. And for the county folks out there and the state folks out there, to build a positive staff-to-staff relationship takes time. It doesn't happen overnight, and sometimes it just takes the right personalities to work through through issues with mutual respect and decorum. Now where it gets sticky, at least with the county, is when the county was drafting their staff reports. Questions and queries could arise, regarding the TCR, and the sensitivity of it, and we could not divulge any further information. We couldn't. It wasn't. There's certain things that there's a line that's where it's like, okay, that's as much as you're going to get, because we're not going to offer any more information regarding this, just based on past experiences where things have been divulged and they were desecrated, they were destroyed, they were purposely rendered unrecognizable. So it's an example of, and a history of, and a result of, colonization and settler ideology, that they have the right to do what they want to do. And if you try to get in their way, then they're going to try to destroy that. So that was the only, I think, the issue that we had was just we couldn't divulge anymore. That was it. That's, you get a very brief, cursory reason and a description, and that's all we can offer. So as staff, the folks on the other end, on the federal or the agency end, just has to accept that and be able to just live with it. And they did. Caitlin did very well with that. She wasn't, she didn't pick, didn't pry, didn't try to trip us up. That's just what it is, and it worked out pretty good. But this is where that relationship comes to play, is when we have those discussions, to work through those hard issues. And in the end, there's no hard feelings or misunderstandings. You both understand where you're coming from, and just move forward and make something happen. You write the staff report as you have to write it, and this is still our denial, and it worked very well. I'm very proud of the county for that, and their ability to reach out to us and be patient with us. As Steve had mentioned earlier, Hoopla's got one person on it. We weren't much far behind. And if you're working for a county or a state or a federal agency, I think you have to realize that a lot of tribes, have limited staff. There's a little bit of turnover, just like any other agency. And we're trying to tackle a lot of issues in a lot of different areas with very few people. So it's just patience. We'll get to it. We're not ignoring you. It's just so much on our plate. We'll get to it. Every once in a while, maybe a reminder, an email reminder saying, hey, can you take a look at that and let me know. And so far, the county was really good with it. The state water board was, they're all right with it. They were a little more, I'm not gonna say persistent, but kind of like, oh, we're gonna give you another, 30 days to respond, or another 60 days. So yeah, end up 60 days, give me a call or email me, let you know if I got to it or not. So once again, agencies, just be patient. And also, if there's any tribal agency folks out there, be patient with those agencies as well, where you can, because they also have turnover and they also have, you know, a load on their plate too. So I think that common understanding and decency to treat each other like humans in this day and age is what we need. So anyways, that's all I have for now. Yeah.
Right. Thank you so much for those reflections, Earl. Caitlin?
Yeah, hi, thank you. Caitlin Castellano, former cannabis planner at the county. Thank you, Earl, for the kind words. I'm just going to discuss a little bit about the process that we went through when I was at the county. So once a cannabis application was deemed complete, it would get referred to the tribe, often in batches. And then after, you know, Earl, as he and Leaf described, they had their own process as well. And then after they got through their process, he would call me. And if a cultivation was within the buffer of one of their tribal cultural resources, the cannabis ordinance, you know, had provisions that we would, you know, deny the project, or we could offer the applicant to participate in the RRR program, which was the retirement remediation and relocation program. So, you know, even though I had to have these difficult conversations with applicants, especially when they couldn't, you know, continue to cultivate or they wanted to cultivate, I was really grateful we had a cannabis ordinance that was pretty clear, that helped me make the decision when I had to let the applicants know they couldn't grow there. So that RR program allowed cultivators to often expand, maybe double, triple, quadruple the size of their grow, depending on how small it was, to a more appropriate agricultural location. So yeah, as Earl said, one of the biggest things was building that relationship. When my supervisor asked me if I wanted to be the tribal liaison for the Karuk tribe, I jumped at the chance because I do pride myself in building relationships and being friendly and kind and patient. And you know, Earl, every time he called, I would prioritize picking up his phone call. You know, we would definitely talk about like how our family is doing, you know, try to build that personal relationship. So I really enjoyed working with the Karuk tribe. And even though I can't really remember specific projects because it was a few years ago of tribal cultural resources that were protected, I do feel honored that I was able to participate in that process and be here as well. Thank you.
All right, thanks so much. So now for the roundtable part of the discussion, and I thought I would get us started. Yeah, we'll spend some time kind of talking back and forth, and then you know, pretty soon I'd like to open it up to audience questions. But you know, one thing, it strikes me that one thing that distinguishes Humboldt County is really the long-term relationship. And both Caitlin and Earl and really all of the speakers touched on the relationship to some degree. And so I'm wondering, you know, in terms of the decades of work together, if you look back, what were the biggest takeaways? What's the biggest learning that had to happen in that time to build these relationships? And has the process of consultation, cultural resource protection, have the process of interaction, has that really changed to reflect, or how has that changed to reflect the learning?
Is that for any of us?
That's for any of you.
I would just say that it has changed, and I think that today the relationship that our individual county supervisors play and the relationships that they've built with the local communities have a lot more sway than they once did. And I think that their personal involvement with the communities has really made a difference and is reflective in these successful collaborations.
Yeah, this is Earl. I'd like to add, and I forgot to mention in my opening remarks, after the 20 years I was working for Karuk DNR, I rarely, if ever, I can't remember any time I interacted with county folks until the cannabis thing came around. But I have to, things got better because we were able to get, John Ford, who was director of planning department there at Humboldt County. He came up and sat down and had a staff discussion with Leaf and I and some other staff and some of his staff, which was very fruitful, gaining some understanding. And we even went down there and talked to him again on a different time. We actually went down to Eureka to the planning office and spoke with him and Caitlin and some of the staff. So, I mean, it's gotten better having those staff to staff discussions and the ability and the willingness to reach out on both parties.
Do you have anything to add, Caitlin?
No, not really, except, I know Earl and I really were focusing on cannabis applications, but then, if he had any other questions, he could call as well and I could find out answers. So really having that one point of contact, I think was really successful when I was there.
Well, thanks for that. And I also just wanted to mention that Laura is going to drop a very short survey into the chat. And if our audience members could please fill that out, it would only take a second. We appreciate your feedback. So my next question is about mitigation. And I'm curious to hear more about what mitigation can look like. I understand that, it doesn't always look the same from project to project. So what does mitigation look like? And what's important to bear in mind when seeking good mitigation?
I'd say it has to be very, it's always going to be very site specific to the circumstances that exist with that particular permittee. Our number one priority out here has always been, while archaeological resources are important, and depending on your definition of cultural resources for sure, but we have protecting our living culture and our living religion, which is a land-based religion. Our ceremonial practices are land-based in this place, and over the years we've had enormous conflicts and barriers to the continued practice of our religion and the practice of our ceremonies in the form of non-Indian private landowners where we have trails that cross through private property and the like, and then instances where we have our annual world renewal ceremony. You have the world renewal priest is actually his trail runs through private property, and then when that private property is blows the place up and property gets purchased, people move in, they cut down all the fruit trees, all the native trees, and they plant the whole thing with marijuana. We had instances like that and build the fence across the trail. And so obviously in those sort of circumstances, those two uses are very incompatible, and but there's no flexibility, there hasn't been in the past to deal with those kind of issues. And we were able to take very cut and dried, in the past we wouldn't have been able to protect those things other than say, yeah, the trail runs through there, that's a tribal cultural resource, so the answer is no permit can be issued in that instance. Well, in you know, what happens to that property then? And, you know, do we gain access to it again or not? So, you know, we were able to use this process to, in certain instances, to provide some potential mitigation to allow some permitted activities within a certain confined area, and open up that access for the ceremonial use as well at the same time, and sort of accomplish you know, a couple of important goals.
Thank you. Any of the other panelists have comments on successful mitigation and important considerations to bear in mind?
Yeah, this is Earl again. You know, I remember, you know, one of the instances when we were working with another planner before Caitlin was Rod Yandell moved down to the county. I think he's still there. But anyways, we had one, you know, the water around here is it's very precious, and it's especially those creeks and streams that flow into the Klamath and create a refugia at the mouth. And we had one instance where one of our mitigation was, you know, they could only use, you know, rainwater catchment since they were pulling out an ungodly amount of water, you know, out of the creek, out of the system. And, you know, there's no questions, there was no pushback on that one. To us, it was a no-brainer, and to the county and Rod, that was also a no-brainer. So that was a good call. But we're also finding out, and at the time we were doing this, just a word of caution, a lot of the proponents, the project proponents, were deliberately underestimating their water usage. So we found out through monitoring through a local agency that, you know, they're using a lot more water than they had put in their application, and there's no really way to track that one. But that's just a cautionary tale for other folks out there who are looking at these applications to, you know, really consider and really scrutinize the water usage that they're reporting, or what they're, you know, reporting they're going to be using in the future. Because even though we had a really good winter, we're nowhere near, you know, out of drought conditions in the long term.
Well, so here's a question primarily for Caitlin and Steve, and I'm just wondering, you know, really early in the conversation, we talked about different jurisdiction having different kinds of processes, and sometimes those don't always mesh very well. So what, you know, if you're dealing with multiple tribal governments and, you know, maybe there's multiple offices, and how do you, what's really important for you to create a process that is working for the agency, but also for different tribes? And I mean, yeah, maybe to make that question a little smaller, what was just really helpful in ironing out kinks and streamlining this work?
Maybe Supervisor Madrone will have more to touch on, because like I said, it's been about 3 years since I've been at the county, but the county designated people to a tribe. So, and when I was there, we had certain designated geographical areas. So I was the northeastern part, well, I guess the northern part of Humboldt. And so I was the liaison for the Yurok tribe as well as the Karuk tribe. And both of them did have different processes, but ours at the county was the same. And so my job really was to just be communicative with both of the tribes and do exactly what Leif and Earl said. You know, no answer is not really an answer. So I would follow up with phone calls and emails to make sure I heard from them.
Yeah, this is Steve. I don't have a whole lot to add because I'm not in the trenches, so to speak, like Caitlin was and other county staff working on this day in and day out. A lot of what happens is when things aren't working out, that's when it comes to our board of supervisors and I get involved. Or when clients and tribes contact me and say things are not working out, and then I weigh in. I'll meet with planning staff and try and figure out how to make things better. Um, we did just recently appoint 2 board members, myself and Supervisor Bone, to be on an ad hoc committee to be able to do government to government relations meetings, discussions, and consultations. So that is a step forward. But really, that happens, when things are really not working out well, depending on the issue. But I also thought that it was really good. The point is that while we may have a great process or a good process, we'll say, in terms of consultation on cannabis projects, no equal type of referral exists with all the other planning. So somebody could be proposing to build a fence and a house across a trail or on a site. And yes, there will often be archaeological cultural resource surveys required, but as was mentioned early on by Leaf and others, that doesn't necessarily mean you capture all the things that are important to the tribe. So I would say we have a long way to go in terms of making sure that our whole planning process really engages tribes in a respectful manner to really look at the impacts of all these other kinds of projects way beyond cannabis.
And on that note, what ideas do you all have for strengthening tribal consultation and TCR protection further? Whether, in the legal context or whether just at kind of the organizational level, what would be some things you could imagine doing in the next 5 or 10 years that could really improve this process even more?
Well, I think, from time to time, whenever there's an opportunity to, there's changes in the county's general plan and the like is one avenue where I think some improvements could be made and processes could be developed. And, like Steve was saying, is that there's plenty of other processes that are going on that we could strengthen and improve in terms of tribal consultation and making sure that we don't have things slipping through the cracks. And so I think just being aware, generally being aware that these issues, and in Humboldt County, we're certainly no stranger to from time to time getting a wake-up call in a really big way when something goes south. It usually goes south pretty big, and responding to those in real time is never preferable to dealing with them out front. And so I think being aware that the potential exists for these kind of nuclear events that happen. I know that we've had one not too long ago regards to with the building department, and some things went haywire there, but there's always room for improvement, and I think just being aware of these challenges that exist, we can hopefully get out in front of these processes.
Well, I guess I'd like to open things up in just a moment to audience questions. But maybe one last question for me would be something for maybe junior planners or junior tribal representatives on the call. What would you say, what would be your advice to people just starting off in this field, just starting to do this work? And again, just for folks in the audience, please put your question, use the Q&A feature at the bottom of the Zoom browser, and you can post your questions there, and I'll take them one at a time.
I guess, oh, go ahead.
Go ahead.
I guess my 2 cents, it's, I mean, really, I was asked to come here because of the relationship building that we did. So as a junior planner, you're just going to have to be patient, keep watch of your legal deadlines, although sometimes it seemed like those went out the window and we were okay legally. Just follow up, and hopefully management has, designated contacts, so that way random planners are not all bombarding the tribe at once. I think that having that liaison really works, that one person, and really just being friendly and saying hello and how are you, and as they said before, we're all humans and we're all people first, and yes, as planners we want to try to get through the planning process as quickly as possible. But do recognize we are on someone else's land, and they were there for time immemorial, and it's important to remember that. Thank you.
I know that advice I would give to, on the tribal side, young people coming in into the process and serving in those roles is, I've always encouraged our incoming folks to be respectful and develop relationships, because that's always the key, always has been, always will be. The key to success is having is developing those personal relationships where over the years those things pay off in a big way, those relationships. So maintaining those relationships are critical.
Yeah, this is Earl. I would have to chime in on that with Leaf, regarding folks who either tribal or non-tribal folks who are just starting out working for tribes, is don't be afraid to ask questions, and rely on other staff for support and the ability to help guide you through whatever project or question you may have. And don't forget to speak with tribal elders, because they are a resource that is there for a reason. And if they're willing to speak with you, you could learn a lot, and it'll help you in your day-to-day interactions with your peers there at work. And with like agency or county, it's not necessarily for a new planner or somebody just coming into the field, but anybody really, especially folks higher on the food chain, is prior informed consent by the tribe, and consult early and often in the process. The earlier you start these conversations, the earlier you start building those bridges and those communication pathways, the better it'll be in the long run. You'll save time in the long run by doing that. Anyways, that's all I had to input on that one. Thank you.
So there are a couple questions coming in the Q&A feature, and please keep adding your questions there. The first one looks like a technical question this one should be for Earl and Leaf. So in cases where a tribe determines a cannabis project is within a TCR buffer and recommends denial, does the tribe typically provide the county with a map of the buffer area so the applicant can revise the project to avoid the TCR if possible? Because of the confidentiality surrounding TCRs, many applicants express fear that they will not be provided much information.
Yeah, and I would say that most of all of the instances that I can recall ever dealing with in that regard, there would be, just the size of the parcel and the location of the grow. It wouldn't be possible in most cases to relocate, further away. And in those instances, I know that that was there were a couple of adjacent properties here in downtown Orleans that we knew that there would be no possible mitigation, and so we actually preempted those and went and sat down with the planning director, and we certainly didn't feel comfortable enrolling those applicants in our system, because we already knew what the answer would be, because there really wasn't any possibility to mitigate for those. And so we met with the county and passed that information along with them, because, suggesting that the county not move forward with their processing their application because there was going to be no way for them to mitigate for those for that no answer. And so so that's how we handled that.
Thanks for that answer. So our next question is from Jennifer Sauerwein, who says, thank you for the great discussion. You all have shared about the importance of relationship building for the consultation process, which can also take a significant amount of time. And so the question is, what recommendations do you have about measures or mechanisms to bring resources to tribes to be able to respond to all these referrals? How can we better resource tribes to be able to respond to referrals?
Well, I think there's probably different ways to skin that cat, but I do know that is a serious issue for all tribes, really. Most all tribes, we don't have a tax base to generate revenue to fund staffing positions. Most staffing positions at tribes are grant funded or otherwise bureau funded, and so there's difficulty in properly resourcing these issues that have a lot of draw on our resources. And so what we did in the instance of cannabis permitting is developing our own internal process. And as soon as we received a referral from the county, we immediately reached out to those applicants and scheduled a meeting for them to come in to meet with us, where we would enroll them in our program. And we had a permit fee that we would charge them to enroll in our program. And that's the fees that we use to send out our cultural resource specialists, to send out our, water resource specialists to take a look at those projects and then write our recommendations back to the county. And so that's how, we were able to staff these different projects.
Yeah, I've heard of this practice of building in, a small fee for cultural monitoring and other things into the permits application fee. I think that's practice in Humboldt County.
Yeah, One of the things when we brought them in for these meetings, we would start by asking them to enter into this agreement. That was a really important part of our process because in this agreement, they had to give us permission to go onto their land to do the inspections and the review. And so that had to be, a legal authorization permitting us to go onto their private property and conduct the reviews that were necessary to make our determinations. And, so that requires, sending out different staff to do it. And so they would sign the agreement, allowing us the access, and at the same time, pay their permit fee that enabled that work to proceed. And so that's really was a self-sustaining, part of the process, which for us was critical because, we certainly didn't have staff to perform those evaluations in the field because, depending on how many referrals you're getting, but you're getting, a few of them at a time. These things can take, time. Yeah. So.
Do any of our other panelists have ideas about how to generate more resources for referrals and other parts of this process?
Yeah, I got something, Jeremy. This is Earl, and I'll kind of follow up on what Leaf was referring to. We were able to devise that agreement for true cost recovery. A lot of times an agency will offer a nominal fee to process these referrals, but it's nowhere near the actual cost to us to be able to do that. So it's better to let the tribe come up with that hourly rate to ensure that true cost recovery for them. If not, then it's just an insult. Like, here's $25 to, process this referral, and it takes, anywhere, 18, 16, 40 hours of staff time to be able to pull over these things, do the site visits. And that $25 doesn't cover for anything. So let the tribes come up with what that number looks like. But that's my suggestion.
And I'm still looking for more questions, more audience questions, but we do have one comment from Janet Eidsness, and more of a comment than a question, and offering some context to something Leaf said about earlier about an explosion at Humboldt County. Recent case among Wiyot area tribes involving CDP that was ignored by the applicant, leading to damage to a TCR in wetlands. So there's currently a plan to remove the structure. It's about 20,000 square feet and restore land to its, quote, original condition. Fines may total about $30,000. So there's a need to debrief the county staff and tribal officials to get lessons learned from this situation. And then if you want to read more about it, looks like there's an article in the North Coast Journal called Poke the Bear. So that article gives some background.
Yeah.
And this was the explosive situation that Leaf was talking about.
Yes, thanks for that, Janet.
So if there aren't any other questions, I guess we can wrap up the panel. I don't know if anyone has some closing thoughts or words about this really important topic of how do we strengthen these partnerships. One thing I often think of is that AB 52, whatever else it is really an opportunity to get to know, for tribes to get to know their county counterparts and vice versa. And so, it is always going to be growing pains and challenges, but coming out of this is the opportunity for relationship, which I think has emerged as one of the main themes. today. Anyone else want to comment before I wrap us up?
No comment, but I am appreciative that I was invited to be on this panel, and I don't think I contributed too much, but I'm happy to be here. Thank you.
Yeah, I would just say that in closing that I think over the years, one of the things that I tried to do every time that we had a bad situation occur, no matter what agencies were involved in it, is doing an after action review of what we did to respond in the heat of the moment to that crisis, and then try to draw lessons from what we can do in the future to head off similar actions. And I think this last issue that Janet just weighed in on, I think those are the type of issues that I think that it behooves us all to take a look at those and look at lessons that we can learn and take away, and to prevent future occurrences.
And so one more very quick question. So this is the North Coast Regional Water Board is going to begin formal tribal consultation this summer on the development of their racial equity action plan. And so this extends beyond just cannabis. So given the emphasis on relationship building, there's a request to be able to reach out to Leaf and Earl to start building a relationship, and sounds like kind of an open request for an open-ended conversation about that effort coming up this summer.
Yes, turns out I'm always open to have a conversation about the future.
And how should they get in touch?
You can pass along an email address or something like that would be fine.
Hi, so I guess what I'll do is I'll put my email address in the chat. And folks, anyone from the audience, please reach out to me if you have further questions about the Cannabis Research Center, or about the project that we did, or if you'd like to be put into contact with any of our panelists, and then I can facilitate those connections. And sorry, I think I did not put it in the chat as I thought I had, but I'm doing that now. And lastly, Laura, if you could please put the survey in the chat one more time. We'd love for everyone to just take 2 minutes is all it should take, and take our survey. Let us know what you thought, if you learned anything you found useful, if this builds your confidence in tribal consultation and resource protection. Okay, great. Well, thank you so much. This has been a great conversation, and I appreciate our distinguished panel today for sharing their thoughts and experience over the last years and decades. So with that, I think we'll wrap up. Everyone have a very nice weekend.